All righty, here we go. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Eric Bradford. I'm with Asheville GreenWorks. My colleague Joelle Emma is our Director of Education. She is on the call as well. Joelle will be helping to answer some questions today. So if you have some questions, do type them in. And if you'd like, you can also ask questions at the end of the presentation, or we can provide you with our contact information, and you can just send us all sorts of great questions about composting. Asheville GreenWorks is partnering up with our friends with the City of Asheville. They are presenting this workshop series that we're doing. So we're very grateful to our friends at the City of Asheville for helping us present this. We appreciate that very much. And this is my contact information, and I'll show you this again at the end of the presentation. So please don't worry about having to write it down just now. But yeah, we want to make sure that we're easy to get in touch with, so we can help answer some of those questions about composting. Joelle, could you take it over just for a second to talk about the survey?
Yes, I'm going to be providing a link towards the end for a Google form survey, and it's really is important for us to get this information so we can be changing the programs that they need to change. Some people, we had no idea, people were really interested in worm composting until we started doing some questions at the end. Like, gosh, I really want to know more about that, even if it's just like for 5 minutes. And so it's really important for us to gather that information, and it very much appreciated. And it also is important because we want to see, are they effective? You know, it's easier for us to get funding and to be supported by the city and other entities if they realize people really do want to know this information and they're actually taking it in composting, or you know, what they're doing with these presentations. So it's appreciated.
It is very much so. Thank you, Joelle. All right. So here's our topics we're going to be covering today. What is composting? The methods of composting, the common types of composters, the common do's and don'ts. I know I mentioned earlier that I'm the lazy composter, so I try to make it as easy as possible, but there is a way to speed up composting. I'm going to talk to you about that today. We're going to talk about troubleshooting, and then obviously down toward the end, what are the local composting services that we have available to us in the area? So we're going to be covering a lot of ground today. So go ahead, Joelle.
Eric, did you want to mention the compost bins now?
You know what? Yeah, let's talk about the compost bin.
I'm going to ask everyone to provide their email and name. Private, you could do it privately in the chat, so not everyone sees it. It's just me, and Eric will give you reasons why.
Yeah, so we would like, so since we are partnering up with our good friends at the City of Asheville, we would like to send everybody home with one of our static composter bins, which is really great for your backyard. And I'm going to show you a photo of one of those in a second. And also a composting tote for inside your home. So those are provided by our friends, the City of Asheville. So this is a really neat thing. So yeah, not only do you get to learn about composting from myself and Joelle, but we want to get you a nice gift from the city for attending today. So what is composting? Basically, we're just taking what nature is already doing, which is the process of decomposition, and we're trying to control it to make it work quicker for us so that we can take our food waste, our yard waste items, and we can convert that into usable soil. So, the common topics today that we're going to be talking about is backyard composting. So I will touch on commercial composting while we're going through the presentation, where you can have a greater variety of things that can go into your compost. But for our purposes today, we're going to focus mostly on backyard composting. So think of your food waste and your yard debris. So why should we do this? And this is, it seems like a no-brainer. And for a lot of you, I'm sure that, you're already on this particular Zoom. So you're very interested in this. You're already aware that we as Americans, we waste a tremendous amount of food. So the average is around 600 or so, 654 pounds per household per year. And that's a lot of food waste. And, there is a way for us to divert this. Currently, if you live in Buncombe County, we are sending around 5,000 tons of food waste to the landfill every single week. And our landfill does service a large area, but still that is an enormous amount of food waste that when in our landfill will break down anaerobically and turn into methane, which is a common greenhouse gas. So we don't want to waste all of that material. So sending it to landfill is absolutely something we don't want. So we want to try to divert all of that we can. So basically, what do we need to make compost is really just the two things for it. So we need our decomposers. So this is our crew of various critters that we use. So it's going to be bacteria and fungi that do the majority of the heavy lifting in the composting process. And then basically their food, the food that they would like to have, to break it down to turn it into soil. So one of the things that's happening constantly inside your body right now is a battle. And so there's all sorts of good bacteria and bad bacteria, and they're all working to try to take over. So basically, when you do pass from this world and it is time for your body to cease its functions, one of those things that happens immediately in your response system is, now that the good bacteria is no longer there and your antibodies and antigens are no longer there to stop the group of bacteria that wants to break you down and start that process of returning you to the earth. So that's what we want to do here is we're going to take the right types of foods and the right processes for our friends, the decomposers, to do their job more efficiently. So where are these things coming from? It's really incredible where these decomposers are in our environment. And there's a lot of decomposers. So, I'd mentioned bacteria and fungus, and a lot of times they are already existing out there in nature. So in soil, in leaves and food scraps, in finished compost, they're going to be living in those items as well. Each one of these items that we're talking about here, they'll each bring more bacteria to the mix to help you break down your compost. And then also, we're also very aware of all of the insects, the worms, birds, all sorts of different critters like possums and such. Those are also considered as part of the decomposing process cycle. One of the facts that I've always hung up on, and I really love this one here, is in some really good and healthy garden soil, you're going to have so much bacteria and fungi already inside of that soil. And it is such a healthy little spoonful of love that we have right here. So when you are composting, one of the things to consider in your compost is, if you already have some good healthy soil that's in your yard somewhere, is to dig up a shovel full of that and add it into your compost. And that's going to help speed up the process of composting, because you're going to basically be inoculating your compost. You're going to add a few more friends in there. And then obviously we want our friends like worms, birds, bugs, and critters to get in there and start doing their work as well too, but maybe not all the critters. So I'm going to discuss that as we go. A couple of helpful tools for backyard composting. I'm a huge fan of the sort of the larger Tupperware type bowls that have a nice sealing lid on them for composting. My colleague Joelle here, she has a great technique that she does where she uses her bowls, she puts her compost in there and then freezes it. And what this does is, especially in the summertime, if you're putting all your compostables in there and you stick it under your sink and it's time to take it out to the compost bin and you pop it open, it's not such a great smell. And then also, if you do have any little trouble with fruit flies, you don't want to pop that open and have those zooming around your kitchen. So one thing that Joelle does, which I think is extremely helpful, is she freezes it and then she takes it out. And this does two things. One, also, it breaks the smell immediately, but that process of freezing is going to break down the cells and the fibers and cellulose inside of the material that you want to be composted. So it's going to even compost even faster. A nice pail or bucket of some sort with a nice sealing lid is a great thing to have. You can use that to move around your compost. You can use it for your water when you're watering your compost, and then also for your mulch. And I'll talk about that shortly. And then for the more advanced composting, we're going to talk about these temperature probes, which you can pick up at most lawn and garden supply places. You can order them easily online. And this is for the person who wants to talk more about, I want to really try to get the quickest compost action going here because I have a limited amount of space. So let's talk about the types of composters real quick. So some of your most common that I think we're all familiar with is going to be that bin construction. So you've seen where people have built 3 bins and then they'll be moving their compost from one bin to the next. You'll also see people using blocks and cinder blocks if they have the space for it to put their compost in. And then also any kind of structures that you've seen, those types of composters that are made out of steel one's made out of wood, but any of these particular ones here that's going to help you contain your compost in one location provides lots of aeration, because air is absolutely critical to this process, and is something that you're able to get into and move the compost around, because these are factors that's going to help you move through your composting process. So bin construction is a nice one. It does take the only sort of con for the bin construction is the space that it's going to be taking up. So if you have the space for it, this is a fantastic way to compost. If you don't have the space for it, I want to talk about other options here. You've also seen where people have just made a pile. My father has been composting my entire life. They've always had a garden, and he has always used an open pile composting method for his garden. He has a couple of piles, and he puts all of his waste from his gardens inside of it. He does chop it up and makes his piles with it, but he has the space for this sort of thing. So pile composting is an option if you also have the space, you don't mind those lying around. My favorite option here is the tumbling composter. In my neighborhood where I live, we don't have a tremendous amount of space, and we do have a little bit of a critter problem here. So we want to keep our furry little friends out of the compost, and so this is a nice thing to have right here. We have Yogi the bear that hangs out in our neighborhood and likes to rummage through our trash cans and our compost. So one way that we can dissuade Yogi is to have one of these tumbling composters, and it works out really great. It has to be, these are not 100% bear proof, but they are extremely effective at dissuading them from having to tear into it to get into there, especially if it's a lean year for our friends. But you'll see a lot of possums and raccoons and all sorts of critters digging around in your compost to try to get to those treats. Pros, it's great for smaller yards. They contain any kind of smells that you may generate. Keeps our critters out, and they're really easy to use because you're not even have to get in there and flip your pile over manually with a pitchfork or shovel. The cons, the compost can dry out, so you have to keep an eye on it, open it up every once in a while, and look to make sure that the compost is still moist. And then also it has a limited capacity. So you're only going to get around 3 to 6 cubic yards of compost at a time. So you may have to have multiple units in your backyard. I have a unit just like this. We're a family of 4. We cook dinner, breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. And our unit that is roughly about this size does really well for us. And then we have the static composter. This is a hog wire composter, and this is what we would like to gift everyone with today. This is a fantastic way to get started with composting. One of the things that I really love about our hog wire composters is just how easy they are to set up, how easy they are to maintain, and then how easy they are to say, oh, I need to move it. This wasn't the greatest spot for me to do this composting. I want to move it. You can move it with just a few minutes. You can just undo your wire that goes around the edge of it, shovel this into a wheelbarrow, and you can move it right on to the next location. So these hog wire composters for us is a great entryway into composting because it has so many different ways for critters and air and water to interact with the compost, but it keeps it contained in one space. So these things, they take up a space of about 36 inch in diameter by about 36 inches tall. So it's a nice little cylinder of compost there. And also we want to be good neighbors, so we make sure we have something that looks nice in our yard too, right? And then let's talk about pet waste composting. This is something that comes up quite often in our presentations when we want to talk about this. One of the things I'm going to go over is the do's and don'ts of composting, what we can and cannot put into our compost. And one of the things we don't want to put in there is pet waste. And I'm talking about your dogs and your cats. There's a lot of bacteria that we can share amongst each other, bacteria and viruses between us. And so we want to make sure that we're not putting that pet waste into our compost. So there are options out there on the market. These are sort of an in-ground septic composter type composting system. It sits flush with the ground. They take a little bit of work, but these types of composters are really nice. They're very clean. There's almost no smell when you're using these sort of things. So if you do have some pets and you're concerned about their food, their waste, and you want to take care of it, these pet waste composting is a great way to go. This one I think runs a little less than $70. There's a few out there that's a little less expensive than that, but this particular one here is been really successful so far. So where you should locate your compost is pretty important in the thought process. If you put it into a very sunny spot of your yard, a couple things could happen. The compost needs heat to process, but at the same time, it can heat it up too much and become dried out. So you would have to spend a lot of time over there maintaining the moisture of your pile. And then shaded areas are good, but they kind of slow down the process as well. So we try to pick something in between there. So a nice dapple shaded area, not too hot, not too cold, definitely in a place in your yard that it's easy for you to access. So if you come to my house, my composter is right out the kitchen door. And I'm very fortunate about that because I am the lazy composter. So if I have to truck all the way across my yard with my compost, it's less likely that I want to be part of that particular process. So if it can be located somewhere close that's easy for you to get to, that's great. Do you think about that? But yeah, shaded areas are going to definitely help your compost from drying out. Something that you won't have to be out there constantly managing. Avoid areas that interfere with other activities in your yard. So if it's right next to a very high traffic area, if it's next to a playground set that's in there, something along those lines that will take away from the composting process. Try to avoid those areas. And then you want to make sure that you have plenty of area around the pile to work on it. This hogwire composter that we use, you'll want to take it apart, a couple times a year, just open it up and flip over your compost. And so you want to make sure you do have just a little bit of room around there. And then, do I have access to water? Because you'll have to check your compost to make sure that it is wet like a wrung out sponge. And I'm going to say that a couple of times. Wet like a wrung out sponge is how wet that you want your compost to be through this process. So what goes in the compost? I think most of us know this, but we always reinforce these ideas over and over and over. So we have our garden trimmings, our Kipton scraps, our grass clippings, and our leaves. Those are our common backyard items that we're going to have, that we want to try to process and not send to the landfill. Now, I have to be sensitive that a lot of this is determined on how much space you have in your yard. As I said before, my neighbor we have very small yards in our neighborhood. So we have to work, if we want to maintain some of our materials that we want to compost. Like for instance, in the fall of the year here, we're blessed with having lots of leaves, but at the same time, you have to think about that. Like how do we want to start up our composting systems? So a lot of the neighbors will bag up their leaves and then store them and then use them throughout the year in their compost. And the same in the summertime, a lot of folks, they mow their grass, they bag up their clippings because that stuff is really great for composting. So it's all about space management. If you have the space for it, then you can expand your compost footprint as large as you would like. My composting footprint is pretty small at my house, just a static bin with a tumbling bin next to it. And that's just a preference I have in my particular yard for handling just our food waste. So these are the common items that we're going to have for that. This is probably one of the most important pieces of the puzzle here, is what to not put inside of your composter. And I will say this as a preface real quick. All of the items on here are compostable in a backyard composter. It is just, do you want to deal with the critters and the smells and the would-be diseases that could come along with it? So this is what we talk about. So we say the top items here obviously is going to be oils from cooking, fat, grease, pet waste. I've highlighted that particular one. Meat, fish bones, dairy. Think of products that's going to attract critters to come into your compost and dig it out. Also think about those hard to kill plants. So if invasive plant species, things like knotweed, roses, crabgrass, privet, there's a whole list of invasive plants that if you put those into your compost, there's the possibility that they could propagate. And so all of that soil that you've made, you have now spread the invasive plant all over your yard. So you have to be very cognizant of that. We do answer questions as far as how do you get rid of those particular plants. Again, if you're in the county, you could burn those items. If you're in the city limits, you could put them out for the city to pick up. You can also put them into black trash bags, leave those out in the sun for the sun to cook those nasty and invasive plants so that they don't continue spreading around your yard. The other materials to avoid here also is, I'm going to keep beating up our friends here, the pets, because we have seen a lot of problems with putting pet waste into compost over the years. And that's why we mentioned consider using either putting it into the trash or try a backyard pet composting system. And you also want to think about this from a gardening side of things. So if you're using your composted topsoil in your gardens, think of those. Think of the diseases that if you put diseased crops in, there is the possibility that those diseases could pass along to the next year's uh, soil and plants that you're trying to deal with. So if you've had a terrible year with blossom and rot with your tomatoes, then a lot of times you don't want to take those particular tomato vines and compost them up and then use them in next year's crop. You would just, if you've had a bad disease year, is to get rid of those vines and do not reintroduce them back into the system again. Some other things to avoid is, if you have a fireplace at your home, a lot of folks want to take that wood ash and put that into the compost. You really have to use this sparingly because this will increase the pH. Obviously, it's going to slow down the process dramatically, and then you're going to have this really awful ammonia smell coming from your compost, and you really don't want that. Lime is something we don't have a huge problem with in this particular area, as we don't really produce it much around here. But some people do ask, can I use lime in the composting process? And also, it's just something that's going to alter the pH of your compost. So our two main categories that we talk about for composting is browns and greens. Our browns are going to be our carbon-rich items. So they decay very slowly. Coarse browns would be things like sticks and stalks, mulch, those sort of things. Think of browns as the sort of things that accumulate a lot in fall. So all of your leaves that are coming off your tree, the limbs that are coming down. The browns are great. They tie up nitrogen soil if not fully composted. The part at the bottom is something I have to talk to folks about, is stockpiling them. So let's say that you have a lot of food waste that you're wanting to process at your home. You need to have your browns and greens ratio to at least 50-50 so that you can have a good composting process. And I'm going to discuss that further. The greens that we talk about, these are high nitrogen items. So you have carbon, which is browns, and then nitrogen, which is greens. The greens, they're going to decay really rapidly. If anyone here has ever mowed grass before and you've bagged up that grass in the summer and you just made a pile somewhere and it just converted almost overnight really quickly, and it got white and really smelly, and sometimes it can even catch fire in the right temperatures, if we've had a really hot summer. But that is just all nitrogen burning through. It's sort of, think of it as the sugar. It's the fast energy of it. If we are working with our greens a lot of times as well too, if we're not making sure there's enough air running into the process of the composting, it can make your compost look wet and slick and then have a really foul odor that comes along with it. Your greens a lot of times are going to be your food items. So your food, your scraps from your kitchen, and then also the items from your yard. So your grass clippings, your garden trimmings as well too. So this supplies the nitrogen for your composting process. And I'm going to say this number a couple of times. And I know that you all probably composted before and you've read online very technical things about, in the wintertime, we're going to go with a 60% nitrogen mix and a 40% carbon mix. And then in the summertime, we're going to flip that over to a much more carbon in the summer and less nitrogen. I want you folks just to remember a 50-50 mix. It's the easiest to use, using that particular method. So if you think of it, if you have a bucket full of food waste you put into your compost, you want to put a bucket full of carbon in there as well too, to help offset that process. And what that does is your carbon, this is going to act like your neutralizer of smells. So if you think of it, if you go out to your compost bin and it's smelling pretty awful, or the compost doesn't seem to be moving quick, it doesn't seem to be moving at all, and the color is off, it's sort of a lighter color, then we need to start introducing those browns back into the mix. They will neutralize the odors, but they'll also help the greens stabilize themselves. So this 50% mix of each one is what we like for folks to consider while they're doing their composting process. You can alter this as the seasons go to speed up and slow down the process as well. So shredding your compost. This is something that my father believes in religiously, as far as this, and it makes sense. The smaller the surface area, the quicker the decomposers can break it down. So you think of it as chewing your food up so that you can digest it quicker. This is exactly the same process, but not everyone has a leaf shredder or some sort of chipper shredder at home to break up their items. And so we talk about folks using things like, you could use your lawnmower to break up some of those items. You could use a shovel to break up those items as well too, so that they're breaking in smaller pieces and they're quicker to compost. This is what I use at my home. Is I use a lawnmower with a bag on it, and a lot of times if there's, if we have any sort of items that are left over from our gardening that we do, leaves, obviously, grass, all these sort of things. So just run it over with the lawnmower a few times, bag it up, and over to the compost bin it goes. And that just, takes out each of the work pieces of the process. It's just, how can I do this the easiest way so it's not such a burden that I have to think about all the time with the composter. If you're having to think about the compost, then it's too much effort being put into the process. Does your pile have to get hot to be composting? So it doesn't have to get hot for just common backyard composting. So the pile, the warmer the pile, like I spoke about earlier, then usually the quicker the process, the more energy you're going to have to put into that pile as well too. So if it's a very hot pile, it's smoking, that means the process is moving really quickly. That means the more often you're going to have to get out there and turn the pile over to make sure you're composting the entire pile and getting everything ready. And I'll talk about aerobic composting here in just a bit, as far as quicker composting, and what does that mean for you, as far as I want to have a small footprint. I want to move all of my food waste and my yard waste. I want to move this quickly. How can I do that? So I'm going to explain that with aerobic composting. But it will speed up the process if you maintain your temperature. I honestly never check the temperature of either my static bin or my tumbling composter, because I know I'm keeping to the bare minimums here. 50-50 blend of browns and greens. I'm looking at it occasionally to make sure it looks like it's wet as a wrung out sponge. And that's pretty much about it. And I'm watching the color of the compost change as well too. It'll start going from, I can recognize items as food items and yard waste, to it's starting to turn into more of a soil-like substance. So yes, you can speed up the process, which we're going to talk about, but then it takes a little bit more work in this process of composting. And then there is the question that comes up a lot often too: does composting stop in the wintertime? And it will slow and in some cases stop. But if you are trying to maintain your temperature, I can teach you how to do that by making your pile a certain size, or making sure that your compost is located in a certain part of your yard where it's not going to get completely wind whipped constantly, so that that compost can still work throughout the wintertime. But it will slow down because that temperature goes down, the ambient temperature goes down around it. So as you can see here, one of the most important pieces of this process is getting air to your decomposers. What happens is, if we do not have air going into the process for composting, what we're going to run into there is a process called anaerobic composting. And we go to anaerobic, which means without oxygen. The process will slow down, but then you begin to create methane in your composting site. So if anybody has ever tried these methods where you've used a tarp and you've covered up your leaves or something along those lines, and you went out and you turned it over, and it has an off smell to it, then you were anaerobically breaking down your compost. It is a slower process and it creates more greenhouse gases. So when you're using this process, which is called aerobic, or with air, we're making sure that all of this air is getting to your compost. We're getting out there, we're using our pitchfork or shovel, we're aerating, we're flipping over our pile, getting the oxygen into your compost, so that we can make sure that it's breaking down quicker and not anaerobically. So when you are properly composting, there should be a little bit of carbon dioxide that's formed in the process, but no methane. This is an interesting one here. So if you are going back up to pile air, when you're making your piles of compost, is making sure that there is air that's able to get inside of it. There's a couple of ways that you can do this. So, browns, I mentioned earlier, you can take your more stalky browns, your sticks, things along those lines. Those are a really great thing to stick into your pile to make sure that there is porosity. So there's air spaces inside of your compost. So what we'll do a lot of times here at the house, because we don't have a chipper shredder, is when a limb comes down from a tree, we'll break it up into, say, 3-foot sections, and then we'll layer those into the compost as we're building our compost pile. And we'll just sort of put them in there like you would pickup sticks, you know, if you'll picture them like that right there, and that allows air to get inside of the pile. So if the pile is super compact, obviously it's going to have very low porosity. There's going to be very little air to get inside of it. So it'll start to slow the process down. And in some cases, it'll turn off the composting process. And one way you can speed this up is obviously if you do have some sticks in your pile, or you put some bricks into the bottom of the pile to let air get inside of it, is getting out there with the pitchfork or the shovel and turning it over. Water is another critical piece of the puzzle. If we're not maintaining the amount of water that's in the process, then our bacteria could either, you know, slow down to the point where they're barely composting or die. And so we want to make sure that we're keeping that wetness of about, you know, something of a wrung out sponge. And I think you can sort of picture what that is in your head as far as what that is. You don't want to have too much water in your compost, and the question comes to me a lot too as well too. Well, Eric, it's out there in the yard and it's getting rained on, and we've had a lot of rain this week and it just keeps raining. You can actually slow down your composting process with too much water as well. So too much water, it's going to slow down the composting process. Not enough water slows down the composting process. So what you can do with this is you can go out there, if you know that we have weeks of rain that's coming and nothing in sight, you could put a tarp over the top of your pile just to try to help out with the amount of water that's going in, the moisture. Good news, it will sort itself out after a few days of some pretty heavy rains. And obviously we can go back out there and we can get some good cardio flipping that pile over again. But water is critical to this process. If you have your compost again out in a sunny part of your yard, then you're going to have to maintain the moisture of your compost. You're going to have to look at it more often than you would if it was in a shady part of your yard. But again, if it's in the warm part of your yard, it's going to speed up the process of composting. So here we go. This is where the lazy composter is going to teach you how to do it the fast way. So aerobic composting is where you're going to put a lot of energy into this particular process so that you can make your compost turn into soil. So this is a process where you're going to have to commit to going out every few days and turning over your pile. You're going to make sure that you're taking the outside of the pile and moving it to the center of the pile, and then obviously maintaining that water level. During this process, if you're using one of those temperature probes, you can check the temperature of your compost as you're going through this, and you can see, you know, are you staying in that zone, that prime zone that's on the gauge here for composting. So you'll stick your probe in, monitor that particular piece of the process, and then making sure that you're sticking very closely to your 50-50 ratio. You'll also going to be chopping up those items to make sure they're much smaller and easier for the decomposers to work on. The process will go quickly for you. So you're doing this every week, you're in there, you're working in your pile. And then after about a month or so, you'll notice the temperature starts to drop. And then it'll sort of stay around a certain temperature of anywhere from about 90 to 100 or so degrees is where it's going to stay. And that means it's moved from its active stage to its semi-active stage of composting. And that's a good space to be in. That means you've done everything correctly. And you'll notice really quickly how the color of the compost will really start to change quickly as well too. You're not going to be able to see apple cores anymore. Banana peels have disappeared. The mulch and the food waste is starting to look more and more like soil. It'll be like clumpy soil is what it's going to start to look at. There's also a smell difference that's going to happen as well with the compost. You know, when you're out there working in it, they'll have a sort of a sharper smell to it in the beginning of the process. And as you're getting toward the end of your finished compost pile, then that's when the soil is going to become more neutral as you're going through the process. 4 more weeks in the pile, no longer heat that's coming in there, and you're turning. So you keep turning your pile and it's not generating heat anymore. That means that you've taken all of the available energy that's in the pile that's been processed through. Now this pile that's not creating heat anymore, and it's all sort of a uniformed color of a really dark brown, is ready to cure. So this is the part of the process where your pre-compost is going to turn into soil. So this particular process from start to finish is about 3 months. If you're really moving, You know, if you're really moving through the process here and you're really trying to go from apple cores to soil throughout the summertime, then you can get there in this process of about a 3-month period. You may have to maintain multiple piles while you're doing this, because it's difficult once you've started a pile to continue adding to it, because if you're adding to it, then you're just lengthening the process. It doesn't mean you can't do this. What'll happen is you'll have one pile that you keep adding to, and you're turning it over, and at some point in the process of multiple years, then you're going to have a buildup of soil that's in this pile down toward the bottom of it. And that's actually not a terrible thing, because then you could utilize that soil in your plantings around your yard, in your garden boxes and places like that. Now, you don't want to use your pre-compost 100% right away, or excuse me, your post-compost right away to grow your plants in right away. You want to mix that into your garden soil to make sure that it has the draining ability that we want, because a lot of times compost can be kind of dense and it holds on to water, and that could be detrimental to a lot of plants. So here's our temperature gauge. Let's take a look at here, and it's talking about active composting. Some of the newer gauges, ones I showed you earlier, are really great now that you pick up, because they have the marked with color coded on there, which I really appreciate. And you can look down inside of it and see what your pile is doing. Now, I will tell you, these probes, they range in price. You can find them anywhere from $14 to $100 for these probes, depending on where you're purchasing from. You would want something with a good long probe in on it that's going into the compost pile, because you want to get right to the center of that pile. So your range here for composting is that, 50 some odd degrees to 150 degrees, and anything exceeding 150 degrees is going to be tough to get to, but not impossible. Once you're getting into that range of 150 to 170 degrees, that's commercial composting temperature range. Most of the commercial composters in the area, they have to maintain their compost for at least 3 weeks at 170 degrees to make sure they're destroying all the bacteria and pathogens inside of their pre-compost. But for your home and your backyard use, that pocket of staying about 150 degrees to 50 degrees to 150 degrees is a great place to stay. I have personally never seen any of my backyard composters stay above 100 degrees, and that's with putting a lot of work into it. But it's still a great process, and still, like I say, through the summer, if you start in the beginning of the summer, at the end of the summer, you're going to have garden soil. I always say this: a thermometer it's a really great tool to have, but it's absolutely not essential for good composting. So when is it finished? So this is the part of the process which I really love. The color is really dark brown. It's crumbly loose. It has an earthy smell. This is important. If you still smell extremely sharp smell, if you've ever been to a mulch yard and that smell just wakes you up when you hit a mulch yard, you don't want your compost to have that wicked sharp smell to it at all. That means it needs more time to cure. You can't recognize anything that's in the compost. So the apple cores, bananas, the eggshells, all those sort of things have now broken down and become sort of a homogeneous dark color. And then here's the best part about all of this: the size of the pile has shrunk. This is my favorite part of the whole process is because now we're taking this much volume and we're taking it down by a third. This is what I really love about this, is because this is showing you that all of that energy it's converting, all that matter is converting into energy, which was heat, and then dissipating away. So just a quick recap: dark brown, crumbly and loose. Smell is probably the best part of this whole thing, is making sure that it doesn't have that acrid, that really sharp smell to it. And then also you can't see anything in it that you recognize. So odors is probably one of the bigger problems with backyard composting. The rotten odor that you're going to get from this is usually because you don't have enough carbon. So your browns don't have enough carbon in the process, or the pile hasn't been turned over in a while, and maybe there's some methane that's anaerobically broken down inside of it. Maybe you have excess moisture. You've had a tremendous amount of, it's been a really rainy season, and you haven't had the chance to get out there to really turn it over or to add more browns into the process. So I always say this to folks in the troubleshooting process: when in doubt, add more browns to your process. This is going to help you immensely through the composting process, because a lot of times the browns is what's curing most of our problems in here. It will also slow down the process, but cuts the smells and the odors immediately. It stabilizes the compost. It adds the porosity back to it that we desperately need. Ammonia odor. So back to that whole of cutting your grass in the summertime, and you've got that big bag full of grass and you dumped it over in the corner somewhere, and it turned white and it's slick looking and it has a really sharp smell to it. You know, that's the sort of thing that happens with nitrogen. Too much nitrogen in the process is going to burn too quickly. So that's why we need to balance it out with our friends carbon. So that's what happens a lot of times when I go to fix my neighbor's compost piles. The first thing I do is add browns to it, and then we flip the pile over, and then that's it. That's pretty much all we have to do at that point in time. That's Dr. Eric right there. Another thing we can think about is low pile temperature as well too. So if your pile, you know, you want a nice pile. So if you are doing a pile, or if you have this in a container of sorts, so if you have a bin that you've built, you want to make sure that you've got a nice pile so that it retains the temperature in the center of the pile. If you have it flat on the ground, it can't build up the temperature that it needs. So it's going to lose a lot of its temperature, and it's going to slow down the process. So it's too small. It could be very cold weather. It's too dry, poor aeration, or it lacks nitrogen. And what I see mostly in this area is just it needs more carbon. You know, it just seems to be the biggest problem that we deal with around here. One of that reasons is because we have broken the carbon cycle for our region. So instead of letting those leaves break down in your yards and you know, sort of just naturally getting back in, and you know, I deal with the same issue as well. We have a yard with grass. Leaves would destroy all the grass eventually, and so what we're doing is we're capturing those leaves and sending them off away from our systems, so we don't have the browns to be used. So a lot of times what I recommend to folks is run down to your local hardware store and pick up a bag of just, you know, double ground mulch. It's usually $2.68 a bag for about 2 cubic yards, and get a couple of those and you set them next to your compost bin. And those are a great way because they're big chunky pieces. They're going to add porosity to your composting process, but also they're so easy to get to. So if it's right there next to your compost bin and you've just taken out your bucket of nitrogen from inside the house, your food waste, you've dumped that in, and you can just take a quick scoop of your mulch, put that into the process, rinse out your bucket real quick, turn it over, and then back inside your goat. You know, a couple of minutes and you're already finished with your process. So I do recommend, you know, some cheats, getting some mulch and keeping that near your compost pile. You can also consider, if you are using a pile composting method, you might want to bring it in with some sort of container. So you want to find a container for it to insulate the sides of it to make sure you're holding your compost together so it can maintain its temperature. We can have too large of a pile for aerobic composting. So have any of you ever been out to Riverside Stump Dump before? They have these, you know, 2- and 3-story piles of mulch out there, and you'll see them just smoking away. Well, we were out there one day, and I did ask, I said, have you guys, what do you guys do whenever one of your piles of mulch catches on fire? And they said, well, the first thing we do is we don't call the fire department, because they don't know how to handle something like this, because, you know, it gets really hot internally, and it creates basically a smokestack, and then it just burns the compost from within. So they don't know how to fix this a lot of times. So what they do at the composting yards, they use a really large piece of equipment to just flip the pile over real quick to put out the fire. So in your backyard situation, I have never heard of anybody making a pile too big that it caught on fire. Actually, what would happen is they made it too big, and it just basically turned off the process because there wasn't enough air getting into the pile to really keep it going. So a good pile size is probably not to go over 6 foot, and, you know, try to maintain it around that particular area, and no taller than. And here's our friends here, you know. So if you do have a problem like we do in my neighborhood of all of our little critters that are getting in, I should have a picture of Mr. Bear on here, but I don't. He's actually our principal problem that we have here is, obviously we're living where he used to live, and he's just out looking for food to fatten up. And of course, our trash cans and our composters is a great place to look. So, if you are in an area that has a problem with bears, you may want to consider a couple of options. One is a tumbling composter. Those are really great for that. Another option is working with a composting service, which I'm going to show you some information about that. They can just come and pick up your compost for you, and they'll drop off topsoil for you, which is really nice. Um, or you can think about, did something get put into the pile itself that wasn't supposed to be there? So did we accidentally put the biscuits and gravy and the sausage, did all that go into the pile, and now we have a little bit of a mess, and the neighbor's dog's in there tearing up the compost pile. Those sort of things. Our critters are actually a part of this particular process. So, when they eat some of this food and they defecate it, obviously that the poo that comes from that breaks down really quickly in nature and goes right back into the process again. So they are considered an important piece, but they're not always a wanted piece, especially in your backyard composter. You can also consider using vermin composting. So vermiculture, this is something my colleague Joelle has had a lot more experience with. She actually sets up vermin compost. She does vermicompost. It's one of those sort of things where you're a little freaked out about it. You're saying, "Oh my gosh, I've got this tub in my house. It's full of worms." It is a pet at the end of the day, is taking care of these things. But what's really great about these is you don't have to worry about anything from the outside, especially if you have, say, you live in a condominium or apartment and you don't have square footage outside. We can use vermin composting, so we can get you some red wrigglers. That's a hard word to say, and start that process of composting in your home. So you can find a closet somewhere or the basement, and you can set up something really easy. There's kits all online for this. There's also a lot of DIY solutions to this. And then there's also the ones that Joelle has a lot of connections here locally, as far as where to get the worms, how to set this up, and then how to maintain one. So there is other ways to do this instead of just being outside with it. So I did talk about those composting services that are offered locally. And we do have two that are here in the Asheville area. So we have Compost Now, which is a service that'll come to your home or business, and it's a subscription service. So they'll come to your home or business and pick up your compost directly from you. And then if you request it, they will bring back composted topsoil for you to use. Then there's also Danny's Dumpsters. So if you do own a business in the area and you're interested in not sending all that food waste into the dumpster, Danny will set up a subscription service with you where he comes and they pick up the compost from you directly. Both of these services here, both Compost Now and Danny's Dumpster, is a commercial composting service. So they can take meat, bones, dairy, they can take paper, they can take all sorts of things that can be composted. Whereas, as I've been saying in our presentation, we have to be wary of those items in a backyard situation. So if you do produce a lot of food waste, or you don't have the space to be able to maintain it, you might want to consider these services. Joelle, remind me, Compost Now is something about $8 a week, and you get to pick however many weeks that you want them to come pick it up. So it doesn't have to be every week. Is it something like that, Joelle?
Yes, that I know of, yes.
Yeah, and it's a great service. And it's something that's easy. They try to make it as easy as they possible, and they're dropping off a brand new fresh container every time that they come, which is nice. Then there's also this, which I love so much. Pet Poo Skidoo is a great service that's here in Asheville, and they will actually contract with you. So if you have pets at home, they will come and they'll take care of your pet waste, and they'll actually compost all of it as well too, which is really a great service for the area. So big. I mean, you're in Asheville when a wonderful business like this can operate. So this is a great service to have. Pet Poo Skidoo. So let's talk questions, folks. Who has some questions for us? Joelle, did anything come into the chat that I missed?
No, I am going to put into the chat a link, which is on our goes to our website, and it gives you a step-by-step short video on how to put your compost bin together.
That is critical. Yes, absolutely.
How to assemble it.
How to assemble it. So does anybody have some questions for us?